Sex is supposed to be messy. It's supposed to be raw. It's supposed to be real.
There's kind of like this spectrum of intimacy. We're getting further away from these moments of intimacy.
We are not meant to be alone. It's one of the reasons why the pandemic was so damaging. Physical connection is super important. When you're aroused, that reduces stress. When you're stressed, that reduces arousal. People get into the deeper stages of sleep more when they share their bed than when they sleep alone. And then add on top of that, you both have these same wonderful hormones surging, and you're just like,
Emily, happy Valentine's Day. I love that we get to have this spicy combo today. So we're going to start with an overview of how love impacts kind of our neurobiology and physiology and whatnot. And then we'll get into kind of Whoop specific data. There are kind of three neurobiological players in the game of love: your brain, your hormonal levels, and your vagus nerve, which of course connects the brain to the rest of the body. So we're going to kind of start by breaking all of that down. So Emily, what is happening in the brain and in the body when we experience sexual intimacy?
we'll just jump in. All right. So there's this whole like symphony of hormones and fireworks of neurons. Your dopamine's going to spike. It's going to give you this like rush of pleasure, motivation. Oxytocin, which is your love hormone, is going to enhance bonding and trust. Then endorphins, which are kind of feel-good hormones, they're going to flood in. They act as like natural painkillers, natural mood boosters. We also release those when we work out in general. And then towards the end of sexual intimacy, you release prolactin, which promotes that like satisfaction feeling and helps promote bonding. So that's kind of as you're responding to all of those stimuli and going through those acts, you get this one after the other, different hormones that make you feel good for different reasons.
So there's kind of like this spectrum of intimacy, right? There can be just the snuggle, to intercourse, right? So we've got this like full spectrum. When we think about dose, so maybe duration, what I know there's some really cool research that you need to hug for at least 60 seconds. Is it six seconds?
Yeah.
I mean, that's such a short amount of time.
Yeah. And I mean, I think like there is a dose response kind of effect here. And you get benefits, even in the stuff that feels a little bit more PG. Even just looking into your partner's eyes, there's this really cool observed phenomenon that when we're like deeply connected, again, no physical touch required, we actually will start to naturally, subconsciously match our respiratory rate and match our heart rate. And we do this when we're sleeping as a totally unconscious effect. And that promotes a sense of like connection and calm and, can release these like bonding hormones, your oxytocin. And so just feeling connected to somebody you love, and connection doesn't have to mean physical connection, has the beginning of a lot of these physiological benefits. It's one of the reasons why the pandemic was so damaging. Like we are not meant to be alone and to be isolated, and physical connection is super important to our like health and well-being. Social connection, even just among friends, it doesn't have to be relationships, are one of the best predictors of longevity and health, especially in like older age. It's protective against dementia. It's like all these things is so important. Like every part of your body just responds to being around people you trust and feel safe with. And good hormones start just at the I'm with you, I trust you, I feel safe. And we see our bodies quite literally sync up, like your respiratory rates match. Interestingly, women tend to benefit from this slightly more than men. This is actually really cool because women have slightly smaller hearts than men. And so naturally our resting heart rates are a little bit higher to compensate from that. So when we sync up and kind of meet somewhere in the middle, our heart rates come down and theirs come up to meet ours. Ours being the women, and then theirs being men. So women's heart rates go down men's heart rates come up to kind of meet in that middle. And so the women get the benefit of their heart rates being kind of naturally pulled down, and their respiratory rates being naturally pulled down, which is common.
So just talking a little bit about the PG stuff, because I find
Yeah.
that really fascinating, because that's a bulk of our interactions, right? Are
Yeah.
at this PG level, right? We're not, we're having intercourse maybe once a day if we're lucky. That's potentially less often, right? So we can really leverage these PG interactions, to increase, I think, our autonomic nervous system function. We'll get into that a bit more, but really, what's happening in these interactions is we're activating the parasympathetic branch of our nervous system, right? Which is the rest and digest, the calming branch of our nervous system, which, we spend a lot of our day kind of in these more activated states, right? Because we're having to do a bunch of stuff, and that's totally normal. But building in these mini moments of deactivation are obviously is super health promoting on mentally, physically, and emotionally. So I wanted to ask you just your thoughts on just the role of technology, because you mentioned eye contact, right? And just looking into someone's eyes, we're getting, I think, further away from these mini moments of intimacy, even with strangers, where we can connect and bond and release all these wonderful hormones that you're talking about. So just I'd love to get your thoughts on that just generally.
If you zoom way out, like physiologically, is it why do we activate our rest and digest system when we're with somebody, right? And it's because it's very beneficial to get into that state because there are physiological processes that we need to quiet our autonomic nervous system essentially in order to make room for. So if our body's in this active mode of I need to be hyper responsive, I need, any threat could show up at any minute, we divert resources away from things like digestion, which quote unquote can wait for later. And we, move them into, getting your muscles ready, being that sort of tense on edge feeling. If there's a real physical threat is incredibly protective and productive. And when it's just I'm nervous about some meeting is super counterproductive, right? So there's a huge physiology environment mismatch that goes on. But generally, the reason why we get into that parasympathetic state when after a even just again totally PG or G level interaction with a stranger is because our bodies are essentially outsourcing some of that vigilance, right? I connect with you, I feel like I can trust you, and then I say I can be a little bit less vigilant because we're being co-vigilant. And we actually see this a lot with sleep. People get into the deeper stages of sleep and stay there more when they share their bed than when they sleep alone.
Yeah, we see
Because
that in our data
yeah, we
very
see that in
clearly.
our
Yeah.
data. It's been
Yeah.
published, even prior to Whoop's founding by other people, right? Sleep is an incredibly important physiological state, but it's also a very vulnerable one. And so if we don't feel totally safe in our environment, we don't get into those deepest stages of sleep where we're the most vulnerable as easily or for as long chunks of time. We wake up more, we kind of spend more time surveying our environment when we're awake. And then it's we don't get quite into those same deep stages. When we're with somebody we trust, we're okay, I'm going to let you wake up a little bit. And you actually see this incredible thing in partners who have been together for a long time where their wake events are out of phase with each other. So you're kind of taking turns waking up and letting the other person get into deep sleep. And so there's this really cool, totally unconscious thing of syncing and taking care of each other. And so it's that release of vigilance because I'm looking out for you, you're looking out for me, so I can calm down a little bit. I don't need to just be, doing it all. You don't get that over Zoom. You don't get that, over a phone call. And it's not to say that those conversations aren't meaningful, right? They're they serve to maintain relationships so that when I do see you again, it's not, oh, I haven't seen you in 4 years. It's, we've been talking regularly and now I'm so excited to see you again. Um, and so it's not that they don't have a place, but they don't allow us to kind of get into that same parasympathetic state as physically being together with people you love. And again, physically doesn't mean touching, but just kind of co-located.
Yeah. So you pull on a couple important threads. Well, number one, there's a really interesting study that looked at hormonal levels when people were texting versus FaceTiming.
Yeah.
And obviously FaceTiming wins. So whenever you can do that, that's, kind of the preferred modality over texting as it relates to, just all of this positive kind of hormonal benefits and impact on the nervous system. The other thread that I think is really important to touch on, and I think we'd be remiss, not to talk about the impact of toxic relationships, right, on the nervous system. When we consider the people we're interacting with on a daily basis, we want as many people around us who make us feel safe and make us feel loved. When we have people in our lives who are doing the opposite, that has enormous impact on our physical and mental health. So maybe let's break that down a little bit, and just to remind people to check your circle, and that we have choices in our life generally, right? In terms of who we bring into our life and who we choose to spend a lot of time with. And I think it's just a good reminder that the people we surround ourselves with impacts our health in such profound ways.
Toxic relationships do exactly the opposite of what, we were talking about in terms of like outsourcing your vigilance, because when you're with somebody that doesn't make you feel safe, you can't get into that parasympathetic state. In fact, you behave rightfully so as if you're in danger. And so you get this like intense sympathetic activation, release of cortisol, strong stress response. Your body can't relax. And if you're, God forbid, in a toxic relationship with somebody who you live with, right, that means that you're always in that state. And so if you're never able to get into that parasympathetic, I feel totally safe, totally comfortable, I can outsource, some
Mhm.
of my vigilance and stress, then like that builds up in a really unhealthy way. This is the Valentine's Day podcast. So, like that kind of long term chronic stress, decreases libido, and, it starts to spill over. Stress is really, really productive and healthy in bursts. But in order for there to be benefit, it has to be like in these interval bursts. You have to come into that parasympathetic state. That's where you get the benefit of whatever happened in that stress state. And so if you never get there, you're just like accumulating, think of it as like recovery debt. And then all of a sudden, all of these processes that are totally fine to kind of deprioritize short term, like put off digesting to run away from a threat, then go back to digesting, right, all of a sudden starts to become problems. And that's why you start to feel like you get like issues related to inflammation. It's hard to sleep well. You just kind of feel like you're not, like your energy's low,
Yeah.
and it's
Immune
because it's like,
function is
yeah, immune
another
function.
big one. If you find yourself kind of getting sick, and check the stress in
Yeah.
your life, because that's usually there's a pretty strong relationship,
Hmm.
between stress and sickness, and that stress can come in the form of relationship. So it's important to keep an eye on that. All right, let's shift gears a little bit. So let's just talk about hormonal changes, things like birth control, pregnancy, menopause. So let's talk about kind of female health and intimacy for a second.
Hormonal birth control has been shown to lower libido. It gets talked about a lot like that. I think maybe a more helpful or kind way of describing it is you don't get the increased libido that naturally cycling women experience prior to and around ovulation. So when we are fertile, or kind of about to be, because if you have intercourse in the couple of days, 3 or 4 days prior to ovulation, the sperm will actually live long enough to. So, like everybody learns in school, right, that like you have sex and then like the sperm go find an egg. More often than not, the sperm have been sitting in you for a few days and then find the egg a few days later. The point is that in that period where intercourse could lead to pregnancy, our hormones are telling us, go get it. And so if you're suppressing that ovulatory moment, you're not getting that big, um, LH surge that makes you horny, then because you're on birth control, then you kind of miss that moment. So basically, we have this kind of baseline level of desire or horniness or whatever you want to call it. And then when we are fertile, that gets really increased. And so, some people notice this more than others. Some people are more attuned to it. That's your body's way of saying, let's try and get pregnant this
Mm.
month.
What is your take on the kind of societal and cultural expectations around kind of sex and relationships, and their relationship to stress specifically?
It's pretty well documented phenomenon at this point that the increase in things like porn,
Mhm.
and its free availability and ubiquitousness like has created unrealistic expectations and puts a lot of pressure, on people to create what's quite literally fake entertainment.
Yeah.
And like stress and arousal are kind of opposite and inhibit each other, right? So when you're aroused, that reduces stress. When you're stressed, that reduces arousal. And so if you start to get into your head of like trying to recreate, quite literally like a Hollywood production,
Yeah.
like you're
Yeah.
putting all this pressure
It's
on
like
it, and
wild
then like this
scenario.
sort of desire to perform will make you enjoy it less because you're so in your head of like, like sex is supposed to be messy. It's supposed to be raw. It's supposed to be real. And I think like if you get too in your head about the supposed to be's or things like that, it makes it harder to enjoy it.
Just because it's so accessible, there's very little effort to actually get it. So that impacts dopamine and the reward system.
Yeah.
Maybe just talk about that link real quick, because I think it's important for people to understand that when we don't have to work hard for something, but we get a reward, that's the wrong kind of dopamine.
Yeah. Right. And then it makes the kind that you have to work hard for really frustrating.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. You kind of reduce your tolerance for effort almost.
There's a lot of foreplay that happens off camera in order to like create the scenes that they create. And so then it creates this like weird expectation that like things happen,
Right.
at a
Without
certain, just
any
kind
of
of
that
like,
anticipation and
yeah.
foreplay and yeah.
And then people feel like weird or guilty or wrong or broken or whatever for wanting things to like start slow, which
Yeah.
makes bad TV, but
Right.
a really great experience.
Right.
Like we said, there's so much physiological benefit to the G-rated stuff,
Mhm.
and even things that like you don't even think of as foreplay.
Yeah.
Like doing something together, like going to the gym or cooking dinner or whatever, like kind of prior to that, like creates intimacy and bonding and like trust that then like, again, like reduces your stress levels, which is going to increase those like arousal hormone levels and then have you arrive at this, the sexy time it already in a state where your body is like ready to produce and receive those hormones
Yeah.
versus like being all stressed out, running around, doing a million things. And then like, your partner's like want to bang and you're like, no.
Yeah. But if you have that incredible, engaging, stimulating conversation over breakfast, you're
Yeah.
thinking about that all day. And then all of a sudden, that afternoon or night, you're in the mood, and we actually get a really cool listener question about the same thing. She was like, Whoop podcast team, TMI, but my boyfriend and I want to know, is there any link between working out with a partner and sex drive? Whenever we work out together, I always end up in the mood after. I'll do workouts on my own and then come home and want nothing to do with him. I'll work out with him and then all of a sudden it's quite the opposite. Any thoughts?
Love the question. Not TMI.
No,
Just like want people to never feel like embarrassed or whatever about their bodies. Like,
totally. Yeah.
it's all fair game. So love the question. Thank you for asking it. Definitely, endorphins are related to that. And the fact that you're both getting the same surge of endorphins, which exercise creates at the same time. So again, like, a lot of intimacy is about being on the same page. So if you just work out and, he's answering emails, he's getting stressed, you're getting the endorphins, then you come back and your arousal is kind of met with his stress, and that can be kind of a mood killer. So I think it's not so much that you don't have the same endorphins if you work out alone, but there's something really kind of beautiful and productive in that direction about hormonally being on the same page. Like vibes are a real thing, and so I think like there's an element of vibing there. I think there's another element here that's super relevant of just, the bonding and synchronization, the fact that you did something together. My guess, because it sounds like you work out a lot, it's also something that you value. I think there's something really attractive about seeing your partner living your values. Again, it like goes to that idea of trust and intimacy and safety, that this is somebody who's kind of feeling, like we have shared priorities, shared values, like all of that kind of stuff, I think is a turn on, right? It makes me like trust that this is who I think it is and, somebody that I want to be around and all that kind of stuff.
It's reaffirming in
It
so many
is.
ways. Yeah. Like reassuring and and not to mention it's like super attractive when someone is taking care of themselves,
Yeah. So that was the third thing I was going to say, right? Like, everybody's kind of attracted to different things. But again, if like exercising is one of your values, you might be the kind of person that just like values self-care and taking care of yourself. Working out on top of that, right? You're sweaty, you're flexing, you might be doing things that I'm like, oh, like he's cool, he's
Yeah.
impressive,
Right.
he's confident, right? And like kind of all of those attributes, if those are quote unquote my type, and, again, this is your partner, so probably, is, they're sort of displaying some of the things that might be reminding you of why you are attracted to them. And if they're sort of stressed on a Zoom call, again, you're kind of walking into not seeing them like in full display of the reasons you were attracted. And you might still be supportive of them doing work, but like you come back from the gym solo and you're wondering why you're not like as turned on. It's because you're sort of not being met with all of this affirmation of like, this is my guy. I'm attracted to this guy, and then add on top of that, you both have these same wonderful hormones surging and you're just like, let's do it.
Yeah, yeah, totally.
um, so it makes a ton of sense. And I think the gym particularly elevates that because of endorphins. But for anybody who's not, that's not the thing you do with your partner, it's any form of doing something together that is an expression of values. And that can be really simple, like doing the dishes together, right?
Yeah,
We value a clean home. We
yeah,
value
yeah.
like shared responsibility.
Yeah, but I think, shared values is such a strong path to intimacy and such a
Yeah.
such a critical component. Oftentimes in a younger relationship, that might not be the first thing that you think about necessarily, as someone who has been on this planet for quite some time now, I will say that that is really at the cornerstone, is that those shared values and then acting on them in really intentional, explicit ways. And that is certainly, I think, a path to greater intimacy, which leads to better emotional and physical health. All right, so that was Jennifer. Jennifer, thank you so much. I know people love when they get a little shout out. We've got another one from Peter. Peter really enjoyed the insight on how the timing of workouts throughout the
Mhm.
day can impact recovery and sleep. And he is very aware that late night meals are a killer for him on a recovery. And we also see that at population levels. So he's not alone. And it got him thinking, what else could have that kind of effect? Is sex earlier in the day better for the body than later in the day? And he's not sure if we have any data around that, but could be interesting to look at.
Yeah, and there's a lot of different, factors to consider when you say better. And
Mm.
that's why I generally don't like the question better, because better for what? Sex is good for your relationship. Intimacy is good for your relationship. It doesn't have to be penetrative. Touching even is not required. So kind of define intimacy however you choose. There are benefits to doing that, in the morning because it puts you in a good mood. It's going to put you on a nice trajectory to feel good about your partner, feel bonded, and you get to carry that with you for the rest of the day. And, there's a pretty well documented phenomenon, right? Where it's like, if you have a moment of connection first, and then, you go downstairs, you make breakfast, and you do something that might piss me off a little bit, like, I'm way more likely to kind of be resilient to that friction because, I just had this reaffirmation of, I love you, you love me, like we're on the same team. And so I think like it makes us let things, just brush by versus if you don't take a moment to connect, whatever that means for you, say first thing in the morning, and then you go right downstairs, you're making breakfast and, something that would annoy you happens. And now you're just like, that's sort of a benefit to starting your day with connection, right?
Yeah,
That there, it
like a
breeds
kiss and a
goodwill.
hug and a good
Yeah.
morning and
There's a cute thing that I make my husband do because I read about it, but, like, if you, hug or kiss for, like and hold it for at least 6 seconds, that's enough to start the oxytocin production. So even if you don't have time for anything else, you
yeah.
probably have 6 seconds. Get your 6-second hug or kiss in, and then that breeds goodwill that you get to kinda coast on and tap into
Yeah,
for
it's
the
like a
rest of the
buffer
day. It's
for
a
the
buffer. Yeah, and it's cheap, it's easy, it's fun.
Yeah.
Um Try it out. Not New Year's resolution, but Valentine's Day resolution. If it leads to more, good on you. Now let's talk about kind of the opposite, so before bed. You're starting to get into a bit of a different trade-off space because going to bed later has its downsides, but you have to balance that against the fact that intimacy in that wind down period, so let's say the 30 to 60 minutes before bed, because it reduces stress, with all the good hormones, will actually improve sleep quality. So there's a bit of a balancing act where going to bed, say 20 minutes later, to make room for 20 minutes of intimacy will actually have like a positive ROI because you will now sleep better. So the 7 hours and 40 minutes instead of 8 hours are higher quality, and you will wake up kind of more recovered. It's like it's worth pushing off sleep because you will sleep better, recover more. And again, like there are long-term benefits that we talked about at the top of the podcast around social connection. And so investing in a relationship with your partner long term is a great investment. Now, there's a limit to that, right? I'm not going to say have push off sleep for 5 hours of intimacy and then only get 3 hours of sleep. Those might be three very high quality hours of sleep, but there's kind of no amount of perfect quality that are ever going to make like 3 hours of sleep adequate. And so it's not indefinitely a positive ROI activity, and it'll vary kind of from person to person. It'll vary based on like how active the activity is, but kind of that like 15, 20, even 30 minutes, it's probably net good. It's good for your relationship, produces hormones that help you relax. It'll increase the quality of your sleep. And so if you are in the mood and you want to create just a couple of minutes for that activity, don't feel like bad or guilty or pressured against it because you're trying to optimize for sleep. Best case scenario, you get into bed 20 minutes earlier
Yeah.
and do the 20 minutes kind of before you would have gone to bed, and then you're not in the same way making that trade-off. But we do tend to see that people do kind of struggle to get into bed earlier, and so often it's at a trade-off with sleep. And so you just want to be mindful of that sweet spot, especially if you have a firm time that you have to wake up the next day, to not make it take too long.
All right, Emily, we've got another question from a listener who's dealing with some shared bed issues. And this is Courtney. She says, "Hey, Whoop, I have a question around whether or not too much snuggling is a thing. I have spent the last 2 years sleeping with my dogs in the bed. And ever since I moved in with my partner, we have four of us trying to share the bed. We try to keep the dogs off the bed, but that has really not been working. They always find a way back up or just whine outside the room all night. When all four of us are in there, my sleep score goes down and my data tanks. Am I doomed if I can't get these dogs to stay off the bed?"
I feel for Courtney. I have a tiny little dog who does sleep in our bed, and I love it. So I think on its surface, no, too much snuggling isn't a bad thing. And actually, snuggling can be quite a good thing, makes us feel safe, release that oxytocin, all those feel-good hormones. Snuggling to the point of somebody disrupting your sleep and not letting you get restful sleep, especially given that she's seeing her data tank, does suggest that this is not a situation that is working. Either there's not enough room in the bed, or too much movement, among all the different players.
Yeah.
There's a couple of different solutions here if the doggies are, Velcro dogs and struggling there. I've seen things like elevated dog beds that get you kind of up to the height of the bed, but still in your own space. That could be a good solution, especially if they're just going to whine and keep you up from whining versus move around your bed and keep you up from movement. It's a little bit lose-lose. So thinking about how you can get them to be near your bed and feel kind of, their own sense of security and comfort and relaxation, but not so disruptive to you as the bed's getting a little crowded, it sounds like.
The elevated dog beds seem like an amazing solution.
There's a whole bunch of different options for that, and some of them even have like a mesh barrier. So it almost looks like kind of having like a crib pulled up against your bed so you can see each other or smell each other, which is really important for the dogs. If they get up and move around, they're not walking all over you. I don't
Yeah.
know from what Courtney said if these are kind of big,
Yeah.
heavy dogs.
The dogs like to be touching you though. That's
They
kind of the
do.
problem, is like that's where they get their feeling of safety is having the paw or the butt.
Yeah. And I think, where it seems like Courtney's struggling a little bit is maybe too much touching,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
that's disrupting her sleep. And so if it feels like too big of a leap to just train them to sleep quietly in their crates downstairs, which I know I epically failed to crate train my dog, so zero judgment there. If they could see and smell you
Yeah.
and kind of be next to you, while that's not going to be what they prefer, it might be the compromise that lets everybody get the best night's sleep. I think very tough on a new relationship if you're constantly prioritizing the dogs over your partner.
This one is it's a tough one to rectify, but I think to your point, I'm like, it's worth probably figuring it out,
Mhm.
because you want to protect your sleep and yeah, just kind of figuring out the trade-offs. And it's a good question because I know there's probably lots of other folks who struggle with that. So I want to finish off talking about communication, and you can take it in any direction. Just a few things that you think are really important based on the literature that we know exists out there, and just your personal experience.
Yeah. Ooh, fun question. Okay. So communication is really important for so many reasons. To kind of tie it back to some of the things we've already talked about in this pod, we talked a lot about the need to get into that parasympathetic state. In order to get there, I need to feel safe. I need to be safe because if your immune system's super active, right, that's a form of not safe. What that gets you activated. But I need to feel and be safe to get into that parasympathetic state. When I'm thinking about a relationship, and particularly one with a partner, feeling psychological safety, right? That I can say how I'm feeling or what's going on, or admit to a flaw, and that's not going to be twisted or held against me or anything like that, or put back on me, is super duper important. And so communication, when done well, lets me get into that parasympathetic state and strengthens that bonding of, this is somebody who makes me feel safe, who I can outsource my vigilance and worry to, and relax. When I try and communicate and it's misunderstood, then I don't feel that like safety. And all of a sudden I get tense, I get vigilant, I activate and start to release cortisol, which inhibits arousal and inhibits intimacy. And so you kind of go in that opposite direction. And so even something that has nothing to do with anything remotely sexy or about your relationship, just having a good conversation where people feel heard is going to make all that other intimacy and stuff just go a lot better. And I think it's also like practicing the trivial stuff, and like having the trivial stuff be safe like makes it then safer to say the less trivial stuff, and up and up and up. And so to get to that place where I can have that really really deep conversation, it's like you have to have a bunch of kind of silly conversations, right? That's why small talk is a thing, right? Like it's really safe to talk about the weather. And then you kind of feel out the weather talk, and then you're like, I'm worried about the snow tomorrow. And you can like
Totally.
creep up a little bit from there and get into the stuff that feels more vulnerable, and you're kind of feeling out there. And then once you've established with a partner that like we can go there and it's okay, all of a sudden like you can get into that really relaxed, sympathetic state, even if you're talking about something consequential.
Yeah, I mean, I think you highlight probably the most important component of a healthy relationship is fostering psychological safety. And we know that when you're under recovered and underslept and, in this kind of chronic sympathetic state, even through your best intentions, it will be really hard to create a scenario where you are enabling psychological safety in your partner.
Yeah, and that's in large part because the more under recovered and kind of worn down you are, the more you act on impulse and instinct, as opposed to getting into that highest plane of cognition and intent where you can filter through, who's the person that I want to be and how do I want to show up in the world and what do I really want to say to this person. Instead, you kind of get that like that snappiness is snappy because acting on impulse is less work and faster than filtering and thinking. So if you're just getting that kind of raw reaction instead of what I wish I had said, it's not as beautiful, elegant, and intimacy promoting. And then I just want to end because you asked, we talked about the conversation types and that build psychological safety. It's the same thing that builds intimacy and good sex. Because if I'm worried that you're about to do something to me, even good intentioned in a sort of physically intimate situation that I'm not going to like or that I'm not ready for, you're going to go too fast or like do something weird, right? Like all of a sudden I'm getting tense, I'm getting
Mhm.
nervous. And, if that sounds like the opposite of sexy, it's because it is. And it shuts down my desire to do that. And so if you're having good conversation within the intimate moment and, feel like you can say more of this, less of that, fast, slower, all of those kinds of things, feel heard and like trust that um, your partner is trying to not just trying, but going to succeed in like making this a good experience for you, then you don't get all those activating, sympathetic, intimacy killing, hormones that say, whoa,
Yeah.
get me out of here. And instead you're just like, yeah, this is going to be great. And you get all the great stuff. And so you want to practice it when you're talking about the dishes and the weather and all that kind of stuff, so that it's second nature when you want to have fun with it.
And maybe just to add on, communication is also nonverbal, and that's where, again, like, even though you maybe you're underslept and recovered, you're doing your very best to kind of bring your best face forward, you still will hold your face and your eyes unconsciously in a way that does not actually promote psychological safety. So I think it's, obviously we want to, sleep and recovery and being really aware and intentional about doing our very best to manage those as proactively as we can will actually help foster intimacy and relationships, right? And I think people often don't see those connections, right? But I think that is such a fundamental aspect to being a good parent, and having, wonderful intimate connections with your children and obviously with your partner. The foundation to that is really, and the path to that is really taking care of your sleep and recovery to a degree, right?
Can I
Yeah.
end with one story that feels really relevant
Oh,
here?
yes.
Back in 2015, we had a VIP on Whoop, and he and his wife were both on it, and they're both, might imagine, totally burning the candle on both ends. And they reached out to us after a couple months on Whoop and said, "Whoop saved my marriage." And we were so, what do you mean?
I remember
And
that.
he said to us, and honestly, like, this is a decade ago, and it's one of the most interesting stories. This has really changed the way I build product here at Whoop. He said, when our recovery scores are low, we snap at each other. And so we start our morning by saying, "What's your recovery score?" And if either of us are red, we give each other space. And so they found through Whoop this like language of, hey, like, I'm not able to show up the way I want to. So I'm not, and rather than like piss you off by like not having control of my face and my nonverbal language and all of these things, let's give each other space. And I think like a takeaway for people is like, whether it's through Whoop or just, a moment of checking in with yourself, it's important both to try to always be in a place where you're promoting psychological safety, but also to learn how to like vocalize that I can't do that right now. And I was thinking about this because, last night my husband was trying to tell me about his day, and I was trying to get dinner on the table for my toddler who was pissed at me because I gave her the wrong color fork. I put my daughter's dinner on the table, and I didn't give her the rainbow fork because it was in the dishwasher, and she was super angry. And, my husband's trying to tell me about his day, and I was just like, "John, I'm not ignoring you." Because I was ignoring him,
Right.
and I was not making eye contact and was not giving him the time of day because I'm sorry, you're an adult. I feel like you need to like leave
Take
me
a
alone.
back
But just
seat.
like that moment of kind of like, uh, I can't do this right now, so that it doesn't read to him, and then of course he realized, okay, yeah, you're kind of in the thick of it right now,
Yeah.
and backed off. But then, didn't have to feel like, why is my wife ignoring me or
Right,
anything like
right.
that. And so I think like, it's so important to promote this, and it does matter even in these little ways. Whoop can help you identify that you might not be in a place where like these skills will come easily to you or relatively easily to you today. But, even if you're not on Whoop, really have that moment of checking in and get comfortable with vocalizing it, because you can then avoid doing the damage that not voicing the situation will just make you look like she doesn't like me, or she's being rude or whatever. And it's like, no, I'm just like in it.
I love it. Well, thank you so much, Emily. This is super fun.
Thanks, Kristen.
Happy Valentine's Day.
Happy Valentine's Day.